In October 1949, the Chinese people celebrated the victory of the Communist Party. The leader of the Communists and the hero of the revolution was Mao Zedong. For Mao and the Chinese Communist Party, taking power was just a first step. The real revolution was about to begin. In 1949, China lay devastated by decades of civil war and foreign invasion. The previous regime, corrupt and incompetent, had left the country bankrupt. People hoped the new communist government would bring unity and peace, pride and prosperity.
Everybody felt that the liberation in 1949 was an historic demarcation. Before that, it was the old society with many ugly things in it. After the communists came, most people were idealistic and they began to fight for the same cause, for a new China.
Mao and his colleagues had a vision of momentous change. They wanted to transform the lives of 1/4 of mankind and create a strong and modern industrial China. The communists forged a new political structure. They set up a network of party branches which reached down from the capital to every village in the country. At local levels, officials explained party programs.
Communism meant political equality for everybody. The people would be masters of the country. That was the propaganda. People would have enough to eat and wear. Poverty would be a thing of the past.
The reforms went far beyond economics, into personal relations.
Before liberation, women had to do whatever they were told. They had no rights. There were 3 obediences and 4 virtues. Obedience to father before marriage, to husband after marriage, and to your son after your husband died. You had no rights at all.
The government's first major legislation made women legally equal to men.
Marriages arranged by parents or matchmakers were stopped. Women could marry the men they loved. So they were very happy.
The communists organized people into work units, which provided employment, health care, housing, and education. Work units also gave the party direct control over people's lives.
Everyone belonged to a work unit. At first, people weren't comfortable with them, but gradually they got used to them.
In the countryside, the changes were just as profound. For centuries, most peasants had struggled to survive hardship and poverty. During the revolution, Mao had won peasant support with promises of a better life. Now he gave them land. Party officials told peasants to seize property from their landlords.
It was fierce. The whole village, hundreds of people, came beating drums. They dragged me to the meeting ground and wanted to beat me. I said, "Don't hit me. I know my family has exploited the people for generations. I'll give you my house, land, everything." After they discussed it, they labeled me an enlightened son of a landlord family. They let me keep my house, although there wasn't much left in it. But in fact, I did well. Many people died.
Officials encouraged peasants to humiliate and beat their landlords. Often, the violence went much further. Across China, hundreds of thousands of landlords were killed. Nearly half of all China's arable land was distributed to poor peasants.
Before land reform, we only had 3/4 of an acre of land. It was not enough to feed us all. During land reform, we got nearly 3 acres of land. Because we had more land, we could grow more. Gradually, our life became better.
Now it was the people who were the masters. They really liked that. Land and houses were taken from the landlords and given to them. People saw that they benefited, so they supported the Communist Party.
The leaders of the party were veteran revolutionaries who had worked with Mao for years. Second in authority was Liu Shaoqi. Zhou Enlai was foreign minister and then premier. Gaining in prominence was Deng Xiaoping. Zhou Enlai was the gifted administrator and the loyal servant who never challenged Mao. He had a human touch that made him both popular and respected. Liu Shaoqi was more reserved. He was an orthodox communist, a cautious economic planner, and a devoted father. Mao was married to Jiang Qing, a former movie actress. During the 1950s, she never appeared in public. Mao was the party visionary, a poet, and a romantic revolutionary for whom no theory was sacred. He was also an astute strategist. Mao believed that China needed strong international support, and within weeks of taking power in 1949, he visited Moscow. But Joseph Stalin was a difficult ally. For 3 days, he did not even acknowledge Mao's presence in Moscow. Finally, he gave the Chinese limited aid and agreed to a defense treaty. On his return to Beijing, Mao addressed his colleagues. Chief among the imperialists was America. The United States did not recognize Mao's government. Only months after this speech, the two sides would be at war in Korea. In June 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea. America was outraged and called for immediate action. The United Nations sent troops from 15 countries to defend South Korea. They were led by the American General Douglas MacArthur. After months of hard fighting, the UN forces pushed the North Korean army out of the south. In October, they reached the North Korean capital, Pyongyang.
The original orders that we gave MacArthur were, when he's able to do so, to expel the North from the South. And in doing so, to keep well clear of the Chinese borders, because we did not want to give them any pretext to come in.
But MacArthur's troops continued north, towards the Yalu River and the border with China.
MacArthur had much broader objectives: to take advantage of the attack, to attack China, and remove Chinese communists as a threat in the area. And he is continually trying to do things that would bring China into the war.
Mao's government was barely a year old and in the midst of radical reforms. It could hardly afford a war, but Mao felt the UN forces were an intolerable threat to China's security. Under the command of General Peng Dehuai, 250,000 Chinese troops secretly crossed into Korea. At the end of October 1950, they attacked, taking the UN forces completely by surprise. The UN troops soon fled in a massive retreat. In China, the government launched a propaganda campaign called Resist America and Aid Korea.
People donated money for planes and ammunition for the war effort. Every family gave.
We heard people saying how our soldiers were bravely fighting in the icy fields and how they were beating the Americans, carrying them away in their sleeping bags one by one. We were so moved that we all donated. One day I got my 2 weeks' salary. I gave it all.
By the spring of 1951, the war was a grim stalemate. Both sides were dug in around the 38th parallel, separating North and South Korea. While fighting continued, peace talks began. Finally, after 2 years, the talks produced an armistice.
The Korean War forced us to recognize, and the American people to recognize, that the new regime, the communist regime in China, was a fact of life with whom we were going to have to live.
In China, the war created great national pride. The Chinese army had suffered terribly, with nearly 1 million casualties. But it had fought to a standstill the armies of the strongest nations in the world. And the Resist America campaign proved how effectively Mao's government could mobilize the entire country. Now it began a series of smaller campaigns against people inside China, people Mao called enemies without guns.
应当在国日产这种开展一个反行贿、反偷税漏税、反盗取国家资财、反偷工减料的步骤。全国的一切外部同胞都应当团结起来，战胜这些旧社会遗留下来的无德而斗争。
Party officials encouraged people to act as informers using special letterboxes. The Jiang family had one of many small businesses still operating in Wuhan.
My in-laws were capitalists. They were told to report all their property to the government.
So
they made an inventory of everything in the store. Later, there was a struggle meeting. The shop assistants tied up my mother-in-law because they didn't like her. They yelled at her. My brother-in-law got impatient and said, "We don't have anything more. You keep saying we have more, but we don't." Then they tied him up too, saying he had a bad attitude. What we used as our dinner table was actually a bench, this long. They told her to kneel on it. It's very hard to kneel on a bench like that. If you bend just a little, you fall. You have to stay very straight to kneel on it. They kept us there until 11 at night. They really couldn't get any more out of us.
Thousands were jailed or executed. People with money, with foreign connections, or with ties to the previous regime. With these campaigns, the communists crushed all potential political opposition. But the vast majority of people were not hurt by the campaigns. For many Chinese, life was improving.
我们有充分的信心，克服一切艰难困苦，将我国建设成为一个伟大的社会主义共和国。